Within just a few notes from the magical music box that became a staple for the Fable series, we're transported into a dream of nostalgic safety and wonder from back when Fable 2 first released. It's frankly amazing to me just how powerful hearing a single melody from this make-believe contraption can hit just the right strings in my soul, just like Fable 2 hit the market at exactly the right time. Persona 4, Wrath of the Lich King, Fallout 3, Dead Space, Spore, The Force Unleashed, half of the defining games from my childhood all seem like they came out in 2008, and most importantly for Fable 2, Dragon Age Origins wouldn't release until 2009, almost 13 months later. Sure, there were some other fantasy-style RPGs that came out before Fable 2, like the original Witcher game, Two Worlds, and Oblivion, but Fable marked a decided increase in quality when compared to everything that came before it. So while it doesn't necessarily blow me away by modern standards, Fable 2 serves as a really important stopgap between the RPG classics and the bare minimum we expect today. In true Peter Molyneux fashion, Fable 2 was an experiment into the interactive capabilities of video games, slowly opening up as developers decided to push the boundaries for player expression, and as such, the sequel to a game that already tackled questions of moral character expanded upon those decisions with another gauge between purity and corruption. But instead of comparing every aspect of the game to the original like so many other critics, I instead want to use this video along with my critique for Fable 3 to do a deep dive into the later games in the series and how they performed regardless of what came before. So without further introductions, my name is Jbjett, and I want to take you on a journey through one of my favorite childhood memories and how well it holds up today, a Fable 2 critique.
And so our story begins.
Before we even begin talking about the game itself, I have to bring up the fact that you can't play Fable 2 on PC, even 12 years after it first came out. Despite several people unsuccessfully trying to put together emulators, bootleg alternatives, and streaming options, the game remains an Xbox 360 and Xbox One exclusive, which forced me out of my comfort zone just a little bit. There's something deeply important to me about being able to bring a laptop anywhere I want in order to play games on my lunch break at work or from the comfort of my bed when I just don't want to get up on a lazy Sunday morning. And as such, the necessity to lock myself to a TV screen without the flexibility to play games as I normally do isn't necessarily the fault of the game itself, but it did still factor into my enjoyment of this game on the return trip. So if you don't take away anything else from the critique, we have to at least acknowledge the fact that Fable 2 deserves a PC port, more than half the games getting remasters that already work on PC in the first place. Regardless, I genuinely enjoyed my time with the game as I worked my way through childhood memories and slowly find out that I didn't quite remember things half as well as they actually play out, especially when it came to the general tone of the game. While I always knew that the Fable series relied on its comedic charm, I was struck by how British the entire game feels, in the typical slapstick dark humor type of way. A situation where the exotic merchant offers a magical mirror for sale is possibly my favorite quote in the entire game.
For as long as you look into it, it will make you beautiful. Just remember, the magic only works if you look at it in complete darkness.
But the vast majority of the humor plays out in a similar fashion as the writers play off of typical fantasy expectations with a dark sense of irony that is just as enjoyable for kids as it is for adults in very different ways. And it was incredibly important that they get this type of dark comedy right, because without it, the world would be left looking like an incredibly bleak fantasy alternative where children are turned into monsters and the noble lords harvest the common folk's will to live. The little flecks of comedic relief and self-aware irony allow the setting to open up a little bit and have fun at its denizens' expense, instead of sweltering under the dark undertones. This is honestly such an impressive feat of writing that I can't help but commend the Fable 2 staff for what they were able to do with the game, while the sequel both tried and failed to capture the same comedic ability in Fable 3. Perhaps even more noticeable is the quality of the combat and its dedication to slowly building up your skill set. It's easy to remember the magic system from the Fable series as you charge up progressively stronger spells and the AoE increases in size, but When it came to the melee and ranged options in the game, I was blown away by how robust the systems worked with each other. As you upgrade the abilities for your ranged options, you'll unlock the capability to roll, to aim your weapons, zoom in and do more damage, and even target the specific body part that you want to shoot. All of which makes ranged combat into a really fun and powerful toolset if you have the buffer space to kill enemies before they reach you. Likewise, as you level up your melee abilities, characters can start to block, charge up heavy attacks, chain combo with good timing, and even parry enemies for heavy backstab damage near the end of the game. So, while you can certainly just sit in the middle of the room charging up spells to obliterate everything in sight, the melee and ranged options have enough nuance to them to feel fun to play independent of any other options. So when you add on the 7 different spells you can use to slow time, raise the dead, push enemies back, and even summon a tornado, it feels like the icing on the cake. Different players are given the freedom to figure out what type of CC abilities they like and dislike while sending out a barrage of fireballs and ammunition into enemy ranks. Or, in the case that you like the melee system, smart play and parries allow you to dispatch even the strongest enemies in no time at all as you knock them on their back for a final blow. This type of diversity obviously results in some interesting balancing problems, as certain tools excelled in different situations. For the early to mid game, melee attacks seem like the easiest skill to use due to the tendency of enemies to get chain stunned as you simply mash the X button, while in the mid game, the ranged weapons really start to show their power as you unlock the ability to aim down sight and distract bigger packs with the Raise Dead spell. Finally, while the magical attacks feel quite weak in the early game as you're forced to stand still and charge up the higher damage options, as you gain in magical skill, the time to charge will gradually get faster, and you can unleash rank 5 after rank 5 spell in quick succession. If you can set up some CC spells in advance like the Raise Dead or Slow Time spells, a couple of max rank spells back to back can absolutely clear the entire screen of enemies. So when I spent one playthrough focusing on melee and ranged attacks and another playthrough only using magic, it felt like a completely different game for most intents and purposes. I was knocked unconscious a lot more often on the mage playthrough simply due to the temptation to run into the middle of the pack and charge up a spell for mass carnage, but it forced me to use my crowd control spells more efficiently in order to survive the charge up time for the high level damagers. Meanwhile, the ranged character felt like an absolute gunslinger as I unloaded shot after shot into enemy heads for critical damage with a healthy amount of aim assist that made using the left stick to aim feel significantly less janky. As I rolled away from enemy attacks, I felt rewarded by the playstyle despite the fact the game actually never has any challenge to it since you can never die. Instead, whenever you're knocked out, you're thrown into a terribly annoying ragdoll state that interrupts whatever you were doing and makes you wait for a handful of seconds before popping back up again. As such, losing all my health felt like less of a punishment and more of an annoyance that would occasionally interrupt the game flow whenever I got too cocky. Unfortunately, around half of your battles with the Fable equivalent to Wolverines named Balverines will also result in this awkward ragdoll effect, as many of their attacks will simply send your character flying with very little warning. And while it makes much more thematic sense that this happens during the multiple fights with trolls across the game, getting ragdolled, then sliding across the room as you're interrupted mid-spellcast can feel absolutely infuriating. It was never enough to actually cause me a rage quit, but there were certainly times where I got chained through multiple ragdoll effects that got my blood boiling so hot I had to mention it here. After bringing up the trolls, I really have to talk about the nature of the boss battles in the game even before we hit the main storyline, because none of the boss battles represent any key figures in the story, which is both good and bad at the same time. Instead of the more traditional story-based boss battles, you'll encounter 3 trolls throughout the main storyline and 1 more in the DLC, making these behemoths the most frequent boss type in the game as they gradually grow stronger and more thematic with each area. They can only be damaged by hitting the glowing bugs that extend out of their body and will hide if you start to do damage to them, thus encouraging melee players to invest even just a little bit into the other abilities so that they have some well-rounded options for fights like this. As such, you'll end up weaving in between the troll's attacks as you try to find all the bugs on the troll hide, or simply charge up a high level spell in order to kill them all at once, which is exceptionally fun to do. Over time, the trolls will start to summon adds to the fight like Hobbs or Hollow Men in order to make it even harder to get off your own attacks in between dodging the enemies. It's honestly such a simple hit the weak point type of boss, but when you compare this to the button mashing tendencies of the rest of the combat, it suddenly feels really rewarding and different in a way that spices up the monotony of cutting through enemy ranks. The next boss expands upon the ideas from the troll fight by setting up both a narrative and location-based introduction to the Banshee. After your character enters the swamp near the end of the game, a human ends up missing in a mysterious fog that has swept through the marsh, introducing the malicious nature of the environment even before the boss fight begins. Then, as you try and make your way out of the area, the fog seems to trap you in an arena that you won't be able to leave until you've fought with this floating monstrosity. For the fight, they dial up the focus on the adds even more since you can't damage her as long as the Shadow Children are attacking you. So once you learn to attack the shadows first, then do damage to the Banshee during the small window of vulnerability, the fight becomes even more simple than the troll. But the fact that you only end up seeing the Banshee a couple of times in any given playthrough means that half of the fun in her fight is about learning how to even beat her in the first place. The run-up that sets the mood, the small nature of the adds that make you almost forget they're there and attacking you, the tendency to focus on her trying to suck the soul out of your character, it's really easy to understand the mechanics when you already know what to do, but that very first fight with the Banshee after coming back to the game was such a fun learning experience that I think it's worth the simplicity on the follow-up fights. There's something incredibly rewarding about figuring out what you need to do without a game holding your hands that makes it feel like a just reward when you can start to take out that same boss in a matter of 30 seconds once you know what you're doing. As for the final boss in the game, it really only works as a boss encounter due to the way the game slowly builds up to the final set piece over a handful of recurring events throughout the story, so I'll cover that later. Otherwise, there's a handful of more humanoid-type boss battles, like the bandit leaders who are just normal bandits with a little bit more health, or the elite hollow men who are just normal hollow men with a bigger health pool. So, while these rare enemy types like the white ballerina are cool to see pop up across the series, it's hard for me to categorize them as boss battles when the only interesting thing about them is a slightly different model. And while the Commandant boss fight has one of the best build-ups in the entire game, they really end up falling into the same stereotype as a common enemy with another souped-up health pool. This is all the more evident as you start to approach the end of the game and get several Commandant mob types thrown at the player at the same time, similar to how the bandit leaders can start to show up in packs of 5 by the time you're halfway through the game. They spice up the combat just a little bit, but only because they throw magic spells at the player instead of shooting bullets, and although this all sounds like I'm being a Debbie Downer, I found myself genuinely enjoying the combat as a whole. The ranged combat felt nuanced and rewarding the way it encourages you to narrow your sights for higher firing rates and damage. The magic system gives players a risk versus reward system where your highest damaging abilities are locked behind a vulnerability phase, and even the melee combat throws in enough nuances to make it more than just a button masher if you want to get the most out of the system. Somehow they found a way to take a one-button combat mechanic for each of the 3 main attacks and expand it into a fleshed out combat option with all the pros and cons you would expect from a full fighting style. As such, I think it's probably the best implementation of combat across the Fable series, and I enjoyed every second of it, except for maybe the knockdown effects. Talking about the series as a whole, one of the staple features across the game is the ability to interact with random NPCs. Make them hate you, make them love you, kill them, seduce them, marry them, all the boring things that we do in normal life. Suffice to say, I don't really care about this feature all that much. I remember thinking it was really funny that there were condoms in the game when I was a kid, but as I've grown older and have had a chance to do most of that stuff in real life, the appeal of doing it in a video game feels less important to me. So while I ended up having a kid on my Fable 3 playthrough specifically in order to open one of the talking doors in the game, I never felt the need to dive into the interactive system on this game, and I never felt like that detracted from my experience. If you like this type of simulation aspect to a game, then you'll enjoy putzing around for a couple hours with the different options available, and if you don't care about this type of thing, then you can absolutely choose to just ignore it at no consequence to your playtime. And then the case that you want to unlock all the gifts that the NPCs will give you if they like you enough, you can also just earn them by simply playing as a good-natured character all the way through without even having to bother with the expression system, since most of people's reactions to you is based off the morality system in the first place. The other major sim-type mechanic in the game is the acquisition of wealth. You can do one of 3 jobs, working as a bartender, cutting wood, or working as a blacksmith, which will gradually level up over time and become harder while also earning more money. And while they all work on the same premise of pushing the button when the bar is in the green to get higher win streaks and multipliers, they all have enough mechanical differences to make sure each player has a favorite. So when I realized how consistent I could get with the timing on the bartending minigame compared to the other ones, I quickly settled into a rhythm, making thousands of gold while watching YouTube in the background. It's so simple, but the way your earnings increase each time you get a multiplier means that once you get on a streak, you don't want to stop since you're already making top bang for your buck on each successful completion. Simultaneously, the leveling system for these jobs gradually pulls you into the flow of things by constantly rewarding your dedication with higher gold rewards that will quickly leave you earning 1,000 gold with every head of beer. It's the type of brain-dead busy work that feels really good to chill out with as you let your mind wander and rake in the gold at the same time. Now, by this point, with a couple 10,000 gold pieces in your pockets, you can either spend that all right away on the best gear in the game or invest it into the real estate market. Every house, market stall, and business that you can walk into can be bought with gold, refurbished, sold at a profit, or rented to the highest bidder, and the returns on all of these options are incredible. If you really want to make money in the Fable universe, just spend a couple hours grinding the 50,000 gold you'll need to buy your first pub, and bask in the spoils of your hard work as you make several times your investment over the course of the game. Unlike in real life, renting out a house in Fable only takes a couple of hours to make returns on your investment instead of several years, since you'll be getting a new income tick with every 5 minutes of game time, even if the game is turned off. And while the simple joy of running around with several thousand gold in your pocket at all times can be a reward in of itself, these investments will eventually allow you to purchase Castle Bloodstone after the credits roll and become the new King or Queen of Albion, alongside some other endgame quests that you can unlock with gold. Or you can use your static gold income to finance a wild trip into the Fable 2 gambling scene. The Fable gambling minigames are in fact so good that you can play them in a separate Xbox arcade game called Fable 2 Pub Games, which was released around a month before Fable 2 came out and allowed players to start earning gold before the game even began. Now, I'm personally not a fan of gambling in real life, but something about the magical charm behind all of these table games made me fall in love with them on this return to Fable 2. Across your journey through the major cities of Albion, you'll occasionally meet the game masters that all wear a distinctive outfit that makes them easy to see and find despite all the other NPCs in the game. After joining them at a table, you'll be presented with one of 3 different game types called Keystone, Spinner Box, and Fortune's Tower, which roughly equate to roulette, slot machines, and blackjack, although they each present some unique rules that change up the general flow of the games. Keystone is probably the most instantly recognizable game out of the 3 of them, and is played with a set of 3 dice, where you can bet money on what number they might result in. At the beginning of each game, you can put bets on each of the keystones across the top of the screen, which will gradually fall away each time their number is rolled until both the 10 and 11 keys fall away, or one of the 3 or 18 keystones are hit. Rare rolls receive higher payouts, while frequent rolls receive pennies, but you can also bet on each individual roll by using the insides of the keystone to make one-time bets with even higher payouts. So while you can make some quick cash betting on the evens versus odds, you can make even more money with the extremely rare 3-of-a-kind rolls that pay out 400 to 1 odds. This creates a type of split in the player base where some people will go for the consistent payouts where you almost can't lose, while other people place the max bets on all the jackpot spaces on the off chance that you have one of those amazing rolls come through every once in a while. So while this wasn't my personal favorite as far as the gambling tables go, it does offer a wide variety of gameplay styles, which can't always be said for most minigames. On the other side of the spectrum, the spinner boxes in the game are pure slot machines with no measure of skill other than the drive to keep going. After pulling the lever, you don't get any interaction capable of influencing the result other than pure chance, and the game felt like it was definitely skewed in the player's favor on that front. Of all the gambling games, my biggest returns came from simply pulling the lever like a drug-addled mouse to watch the pretty coins go whoosh in between a jackpot or two. It was stupid, there was no self-deliverance, no control over your fate, simply some amazing animations, bright colors, and emblematic sound effects that tell the story of addiction and greed, all of which I was able to finance off of a booming real estate empire that allowed me to just keep throwing money at the screen until the board lit up and gave me the serotonin that I wanted. It shouldn't be as rewarding as it was, but Spinnerbox was also the type of minigame that I could keep playing as I did other things like pull out the dishes, making dinner, and playing with my cat as my other hand pressed the A button every couple of seconds and heard the fancy sounds play over the TV. It sounds kinda boring when I talk about it like this, but it also feels incredibly good in the moment when everything comes together and you get a couple of good rolls in a row and earn several thousand gold at a time. Finally, we have the Fortune's Tower minigame, which feels like it's the most skill-based of the three of them since you can back out of the match at any time. Essentially, every round the dealer lays on the track, you can back out and take the value of the current row of cards times whatever bet multiplier you have on hand. But the tower also gets wider as you get further down the table, resulting in higher numbers and a jackpot if you can reach the bottom without triggering the misfortune. These misfortunes happen when a card matches the card above it, and it will make you lose the hand unless the gate card on the top of the board can replace the misfortune with something that doesn't match. Otherwise, there's a couple of hero cards in each deck that will protect that entire row from misfortune regardless of how many matches there are, and you can already see just how complicated this minigame can start to be. If you make it to the bottom of the board with a score multiplier by matching several numbers of a kind on a single row, the payouts are big, but you can also make tinier returns by cashing out whenever the number goes above 15 to receive the difference between your bet and the round winnings. Unfortunately, there's just as good of a chance that you will lose the hand in the first two rows before the risk versus reward nature of the game can really even get into the swing of things. So while I eventually developed a general game plan where I would cash out whenever my gate card was used, this was the only gambling minigame where it feels like the odds are against the player. When you win, you typically only win a couple of coins at a time, whereas when you lose the first two plays, you still lose your entire bet, and it feels like there was nothing you could have done about it. I still had a lot of fun playing around with the system, trying to figure out how to make good plays versus bad, but I ended up walking away from it with a distinct impression that the game was rigged in the house's favor a lot more than your other options. Now, you've probably noticed some alternate playing tables in the gameplay that I've been showing where you can occasionally encounter different variants of the game. There's a spinner box with 7 slots instead of 3, and a keystone table where you can bet on the numbers that you don't think the dice will land on, which make up some really interesting alternatives to the basic tables. So while there were some moments of frustration as I ran into strings of bad luck, the sheer joy of finding these random minigames strewn about the game world with enough nuance and creativity to spark my desire to learn really struck me as a highlight in the game as a whole. There had never been another game where I've been so entertained by the simple loop of making tons of money, working as a bartender, buying the pub the gambling den is running out of, playing until I'm several thousand gold in debt for pure fun, then murdering the game master when he gets mad at me for walking away without paying down my tab. This is the type of emergent gameplay that I could probably find in other open world titles, but in Fable, it felt like I stumbled into an amazing story by pure coincidence instead of trying to make it happen by role-playing as someone else. Talking about roleplay, I've mentioned the morality system a couple of times up until this point, but it's such an important part of the Fable series that I really need to go into depth on the mechanic as a whole. Instead of following the simple good versus evil binary that you can see in most games like the Paragon and Renegade system, Fable 2 introduces another binary choice between pure and corrupt, which sounds a lot cooler than it actually is in practice. The good versus evil bar basically gets manipulated by your quest decisions, as well as your choices between killing innocents and donating to the Temple of Light as your primary ways of manipulating your alignment outside of those handful of choices. On the other side of the coin, pure versus corrupt is entirely focused on gold and the lengths that you're willing to go to in order to receive it. If you hike up the prices on all your rental properties, your character will become more corrupt, whereas you can also rent at a discount to increase your purity, as well as doing random acts of philanthropy. And while this does result in some interesting combinations of moral gray, such as the corrupt good character who has both golden hair and flies following them at the same time, trying to figure out what the actual visual differences between each of these moral gauges is kind of hard to do, simply because you need to match your purity to your alignment in order to get the biggest results. For example, a good character will receive a Caucasian skin, golden hair, and golden eyes, while an evil character will receive gray skin, black hair, and red eyes. So it's only when you match the corruption on an evil character that it crosses the line and gives you lava skin and horns, or matching the pure character with the good alignment that gives you a halo over your head. Otherwise, pure versus corrupt only affects your skin complexion and the presence of flies around your character. Regardless, I always thought that the sheer differences in appearance between the two playthroughs is really cool, especially when you factor in the fact that certain things like how melee skills will increase the brawn of your character, while heavy magic will cause your body to glow with magical veins. So the only problem that the system runs into is the fact that it's much easier to make your character evil than it is to make them both good and pure. On my evil playthrough, I was able to grow horns and lava skin by the time I hit the spire at the halfway point in the game, while my good-natured character still looked more or less the same as they did at the beginning at that same point in time. In fact, on my good playthrough, I wasn't able to reach the combined levels of good and pure to receive a halo until I had already beaten the game and completed both of the DLC expansions with the resulting moral choices. Sure, you could theoretically grind out the gold at your bartending job to donate to the temple early on, but the ability to go on random killing sprees with almost no consequences from the beginning of the game is both rewarding and easy in comparison to the good-natured route. The game tries to make up for this by making most of the evil choices almost entirely abhorrent for no reason, but the sheer ease of collection for evil points allows you to feel much more free to choose other options than your good-natured counterpart. The game complicates this all even more by introducing factors like the Shadow Court that gave my good character glowing red eyes despite the fact that it was the good choice, making them look particularly evil despite everything I had done up until that point. Altogether, I like the physical appearance effects for this morality system, but the mechanics by which you get there are a little messy around the edges when you start comparing both options. As I listen back to the last couple minutes of voiceover, it dawned on me that I've been talking really fast about all these different systems, and that's because it's just so fun to explore all the different options the game has to offer that I'm excited about all of this in a really strong, really childish way, that these systems where you're just allowed to gamble away your time, where you're allowed to make money, where you're allowed to express your character through these different moral alignments and different cosmetic options, is just so fun to talk about that I can't help myself but try and get it out as fast as possible, because this is the type of stuff that I really love. This is probably one of the best parts of Fable 2 as a whole. The type of things that I can't do in any other video game and that break me out of that adult mindset of just looking at the mechanics of things into actually caring about what I was doing in the game world and just having fun, which is so worthwhile. So with all that said and done, I think I've introduced most of the actual mechanics for the game with enough depth for us to focus on the story from here on out. We start Fable 2 as an orphan child in the center of Bloodstone's old district, where you and your sister beg for food, until one day you come across a mysterious merchant that offers a music box that can grant any wish you desire. 5 gold pieces later, and you're one step closer to realizing your dream of living in Castle Bloodstone, where the Lord Lucian rules the land, but I can't just skip those gold pieces quite so easily. While they serve as the tutorial for the game, teaching you how to hit things, interact with objects, and suit the bugs, the most important factor they introduce is the moral binary that makes up every choice in the game. Be an asshole or act like a saint, usually for very similar rewards. The nature of doing evil for evil's sake alone is treated like its own justification for your actions, and your childhood is no different. Kill 5 bugs to help a warehouse owner, or crush all of his merchandise to ruin his business for exactly the same reward. Give a drunk his alcohol back to encourage his bad habits, or give his friend the alcohol to keep him safe for exactly the same reward. Hand over the wanted posters to the criminal to submerge the borough in crime, or give them back to the city guard to make the old quarter into a beautiful place to live for exactly the same reward. You're not making these choices because it's the convenient choice, you're making them because you want to play an evil character, because the game never establishes any good reason why you would want to take these actions any other way. Otherwise, the tutorial section also introduces you to the recurring character Barnum and his magicalifical photography device that sets the stage of the time period for the game somewhere around the Renaissance era. Similarly, they introduce your trusty dog after you save him from a street bully and make a lifelong friend. Never said it was a long life. But now you've bought the magic music box and retreated to a hole in the wall that you call your home to make your wish before calling it quits for the night. Nothing really happened as the music box vanishes in a flurry of sparks until the city guard wake you from your sleep in order to escort you to Lord Lucian. His butler quickly reveals Lord Lucian's interest in the magical box you bought earlier that day, as well as reminding the two of you not to mention the late Mrs. Fairfax and his child that tragically died some time ago. So as you enter the study, it's heavily alluded to that the Lord Lucian is a man who's devoted himself to his studies in order to run away from his past mistakes. After some tests, Lucian decides that the two of you represent something special, something strong in the making, and a threat to everything he aspires to, so he solves the problem. You survive the fall, and the blind seer named Teresa brings you to an old gypsy camp for you to recover. Time passes and your body recovers, but the feelings of vengeance still burn in your little heart as you mourn the loss of your sister in a struggle that's hardly even begun. Eventually, Teresa decides that you're ready for whatever comes next, and you quickly make your way into the depths of the Heroes Guild below Bower Lake, until you open a chest and the game crashes. I did in fact play this game on my original Xbox 360, which may or may not be around 13 years old, so I'm gonna mention the technical problems I ran into the game, but I don't necessarily hold it against Fable 2 because it's more of a mechanical problem than the actual software. They did the best they could with what they had, and while the game looked absolutely stunning when it first came out, it's not going to win any awards in today's market, especially with all the After Effects filters that they threw onto the visuals. Regardless, I eventually made it past the boss chest and found the headquarters room we'll be coming back to across the entire length of the story. The murals along the wall retell the story of the original Fable game, but it's mostly just an excuse to get you down there to unlock magic, which supposedly only reveals itself to extraordinary heroes throughout time, despite the fact that every single bandit leader can use magic without being a hero. After this, you fight some enemies, complete another unimportant moral choice, and set off to meet Teresa in Bloodstone Market. With this, they implemented a really interesting aspect of older style games where they tried to take into account the time it takes to traverse distance, by making the game world pass some odd hours every time you fast travel to distant areas. And ultimately, this only really ends up affecting the store sales that may or may not be going on at the time, or what job minigames are currently available, so it's not really too important in the grand scheme of things. Once you make it to the market square, Teresa will make you spend 5 minutes just wandering around while you wait for her, encouraging players to check out all the stores, maybe do a bit of gambling, and making money with the blacksmithing job type like they knew these were some of the most engrossing time sinks in the entire game. At the time, it seems kind of silly that you're forced to wait 5 minutes of real time for the next quest to become available, especially since Teresa's supposedly capable of teleportation, but it does a good job making the player explore the simulation aspects of the game without outright forcing you into doing each thing at least once. So now that they've introduced you to these options, the story is ready to move forward as Teresa shows you the spire that Lucian has spent the entire time skip building, along with his end goal of bringing his family back to life. You're then charged with finding the 3 heroes of might, will, and skill in order to put an end to Lucian's plan, which ultimately boils down to a series of repeating events. You travel to a new town, you're tasked with completing side quests to get your renown stat up to a certain level, then you unlock and complete a main quest that rewards you with the help of the next hero before doing it all again. They also threw in an odd quest or two to make you raise gold for different reasons, but the simple loop draws the focus to the key pillars of the Fable design. First, they want you to explore. Along the way to the first hero, you pass through the Bloodstone Old Town and you see the result of your actions as a kid before battling your way through the bandit camps in Rookridge, exploring the Hob Caves with a companion that gives you the exposition for the area, then running past the Temple of Evil to finally arrive in Oakfield. Next, the developers introduce the side quests since the Temple of Light doesn't necessarily trust you yet, so you have to head back out and do some random tasks that only end up unlocking when you get to this stage in the game, where the renowned stat points you get from them actually start to matter. You meet up with the recurring character with extrapolationary charm named Barnum, help him out with a task clearing off the bandits from Rookridge, and earn enough trust to make your way further in the main quest. So finally, the game rewards the player by progressing the main plot with a set-piece dungeon and the cinematic handshake as you earn the next hero on your journey. It's a simple setup for a game that they're able to repeat a total of 3 times without most people noticing, simply because it's all linked by different areas to explore, monsters to kill, and story sequences to see. If it repeated the same scenarios over and over, people would be bored by the repetition of events, but the strength behind having an 8-hour-long story is the fact that you can throw something new at the player at every turn without running out of resources. Then, when players finish the storyline and take the time to really explore the leftover side quests, the collectible keys, the talking doors, the economy system, and the addictive gambling setups, you're looking at something closer to a 20-hour experience of which you haven't seen anything from the other side of the morality system if you've only gone through the game once. It's not expansive, and it's not exhaustive in terms of gameplay time they could have made you put into things, but it does help them boil things down to the highlights of the game and everything it has to offer in a short time period. Case in point, it's hard to get bored of a game that only lasts 20 hours. Regardless, Fable 2 makes up for its short runtime with a sense of true wit for storytelling. After we finally worked up the stat requirements to meet the hero's strength, we find her singing a tune to herself while lounging on the ruined entryway to the temple grounds, immediately introducing players to the type of person she is. A force for good, raised by the monks of light, yet still capable of unleashing violence and strength in the event of any threat to her peaceful world. The song she hums draws the player in, allowing us to see the person behind the brawn, as well as introducing a sense of irony when many players may have been expecting her to look different as the hero of might. The story slowly expands on this idea by introducing the layers of her character one at a time, as we follow her journey from a simple monk into the woman capable of fulfilling the name Hero. Lucian's men close in on the Temple of Light while the two of you are gathering sacred water, and when Hannah finally makes it back to her father, it's already too late. With a single swing of her hammer, she's taken the leap and plunged into a world of violence as the hero, and Teresa takes her under your wing as you begin to strike back against Lucian. So in typical villainous fashion, Lucian sows the seeds for his own downfall, allowing us to recruit the first of 3 heroes. But unlike most villains, Lucian has a penchant for performing quite well despite his mistakes. He beats us to the next hero, the mage named Garth, who has already taken up open rebellion against Lord Lucian, and inevitably gets captured right in front of our eyes. The next section of the game is probably my favorite storyline overall, as you fight your way through the Balverine-infested halls of the Howling Crypts, make your way to the town of Westcliff, and its claim to fame, the Crucible. Knock out a couple of side quests to make a name for yourself, and finally enter the deadly arena to prove your worth as a guardsman capable of serving in Lucian's Spire. This section is iconic for a multitude of reasons, as you're caught in a trap by the White Balverine, you make a choice whether to support Barnum's renovations of the bandit-controlled Westcliff village, and then you finally earn an enormous amount of experience points in the Crucible battles. Now, that last part about earning a crazy amount of experience may seem unimportant, but when you're able to triple or even quadruple the amount of experience that you have within a period of around 30 minutes of gameplay, the fights in the Crucible quickly catapulted my characters to the ultimate levels of ability power on both playthroughs of the game in a way that you really don't receive experience anywhere else. And a large reason for this power jump as a result of the Crucible is the fact that experience only ever seems to come from combat, especially since side quests only reward the invisible stat called Renown as a progress blocker on the main quest. So when you're quickly thrown into 3 large-sized battles per arena stage, and the game pushes you through 8 rounds of this over the course of 30 minutes, this can quickly become the vast majority of combat in the entire game, condensed into a very short period of time. Then, when you add on the dense nature of the battles, the AoE ability of magic skills, and the resetting traps that make the combat even easier to deal with, it's no wonder that this rewards an incredible amount of EXP. So while this feels like an immediate reward for the player that made it to the halfway point in the game, it was also quite necessary for the developers to ensure that players would have the tools required to stand up to the enemies they throw at you across the end of the game. After all, the entire reason we had to beat the Crucible was to eventually make our way into the Spire and try to free Garth. So the game is about to start throwing its final enemy type at the player as you meet the Spire guards. Fable 2 knows how important this section is to the world and introduces you to the Spire with a cinematic journey across the barren sea into a construction that can only be described as a prison of enormous magnitude. So as you slowly walk down the pier, flanked by guards and the other aspiring workers that made the journey with you, we finally get another look at Lucian as he greets his new workers with a grand speech. And despite a perfect shot at ending the storyline early, the player character has no option to use your magical skills to throw a fireball in the villain's face. While the actual ending to the game tries to explain your inability to do anything in this scene, it remains as something that frustrates me to this day when Lucian displays a weird ability to put your entire group to sleep and strap on some kill switches around your neck to ensure obedience. The rest of your time in the Spire passes in a blur as several months pass in between each time skip and you get control of your main character. You eventually find Garth in the prisons, who telepathically tells you to simply bide your time until he has a plan, and so you're forced into a series of moral choices between following the will of Lucian and trying to be a good person. Will you follow the orders of the evil commandant like a dog, or resist? Will you willingly starve the prisoners, or feed them despite your orders? Will you take the life of your co-worker as you watch them slowly descend into madness, or spare their lives as your very experience points are drained through the collar? They're all really cool ideas and thought experiments, since being good actually has a consequence this time, while being evil has an immediate gain, but ultimately tainted by some awkward design decisions. Being evil requires you to simply stand there watching the prisoners starve for around 3 minutes, which got boring really fast when they never really say anything interesting and you're just forced to stand there staring at your character for some odd minutes. Same thing for the act of following orders, where the evil act is to behave and the good act is to resist, which feels kind of out of place for both parties since it acts the opposite way the rest of the game. And finally, before you can spare the man you're asked to kill, you're forced to pick up a sword from the commandant, despite it being the good choice to refuse orders in the past, leading to an awkward situation where I didn't want to pick up the sword on my good playthrough until I eventually realized the quest couldn't move forward until I got past that trigger. Then this is also compounded by the fact that you remain a guardsman on the Spire for a total of 10 years, no matter how well or poorly you perform your work. Like there aren't another 1,000 people trapped on the Spire that would gladly do your job without question. But either way, you're tasked with finding a missing guard down in the detention cells, which Garth uses as a chance to free the two of you from your Suicide Squad collars with a flash of magic. Apparently, it took him 10 years to slowly build up the will to cast 2 lightning spells, which makes sense considering how long it takes me to summon the will to get out of bed in the morning, but what ensues is a fight to the death as you work your way through several groups of Spire guards with little difficulty before finally confronting the Commandant in his inner quarters. He ultimately becomes the equivalent to a punching bag boss fight as you just throw attack after attack at him until he stops responding. But at least it's cool to hear his dialogue as he acknowledges your promise as a potential officer if you obeyed his orders on the evil side. After you eventually work your way through his health pool, Garth will regain his powers, open up a Cullis gate to the docks, and the two of you cause mayhem as you finally fight your way back to the mainland. It ends up being a surprisingly well-paced jailbreak sequence with almost constant action as you make your way out of the spire only to be greeted by Teresa and your dog. It's at this point that most players may have noticed that the dog also changes appearance based upon your alignment between good and evil, which really doesn't make any difference to the gameplay but feels like an incredibly rewarding thematic touch. Either way, you've just recruited the next hero in your journey and we're about to be led into one of the most contrived quests in the entire game, the Coal Escape. Supposedly, Hannah has found some information that the hero of skill might be hiding in a pirate city named Bloodstone that's surrounded by the Wraith Marsh on 3 sides and the ocean on the 4th, so the only way anyone can think to make it there is to activate a teleportation circle at Garth's old estates. So you make your way back to the place that Garth was originally caught by Lucian, alert his troops that start teleporting in via the giant obelisk monster that also captured Garth the first time you were here, and fight off wave after wave of spire guards until the Coal's Gate has opened. A couple seconds later, and it appears that something went wrong with the teleportation circle this time, causing you to black out upon arrival and get captured by some random stranger in the marsh. He lasts about 60 seconds before getting eaten by a banshee despite the fact that he's lived here his entire life, and your trusty dog comes to save the day with the keys. It's all at once cute, establishes yet another reason to love the dog, and absolutely nonsensical as to why you blacked out going through the portal or how a native marsh dweller was caught unaware of the frequent banshee attacks in the area. The game never really addresses this, so you move on through the marsh, fighting hollow men and several banshees until you eventually make it to Bloodstone, only to find the hero's skill languishing in his manor. So the thing that really ticks me off about this whole sequence of events is the fact that once this is all said and done, you can take a ship back to Bowerstone Market for only 25 gold a trip, which is so redundantly easy in comparison to what we just went through that the entire Coal's Gate situation seems entirely pointless. It's like our heroes wanted to follow the rule of cool instead of just taking a boat like any other normal person. So the game tries to sidestep this entire situation by introducing the character Reaver, who quickly wins over people's hearts and minds with his charismatic voice acting. I can't even think about the character without hearing some type of defining work by Stephen Fry play in the back of my mind, because his voice is really just so iconic with my enjoyment of the Fable games and British humor in general. In case you don't know who Stephen Fry is outside of the Fable universe, stop watching this and go look up the QI TV series where Stefan used to host a comedic trivia show where everything's made up and the points don't matter. Otherwise, his role as the suave villain and gunslinger really pulls together the final moments of the game in a way that it probably wouldn't work any other way due to the sheer speed at which the ending is approaching. Reaver wants you to do some quests and become famous enough to be worth talking with, which is easily done as we tackle the 3rd set of side quests that unlock throughout the game. And you should probably take the opportunity to check up on Barnum and receive your just rewards for the investment in Westcliff, but after dealing with the pirate adventure or the Temple of Benevolent Yokels, you'll soon find yourself back at Reaver's mansion. The hero of skill puts you on one final task as he requests your help returning the Shadow Seal to some friends under the Wraith Marsh, and you set off on the final dungeon run in the game. Several battles with black recolors of the traditional enemies you fought up until this point later, and you'll make your way to the final chamber with a very confused girl and the Court of Shadows. It turns out that Reaver presents the court with a youthful figure for them to steal the life force from and give it to the hero of skill in the form of everlasting life, in a type of bargain that appears to have been going on for quite some time. As such, we're presented with the second to last moral choice in the entire game. Yes, that's correct. This is the 10th moral choice in the main quest out of the 11 major choices you make in your journey, which sounds much more disappointing than it feels in practice. There's the 5 moral choices during the tutorial section of the game as you make the 5 gold coins. Then you have to make the choice between giving some random prisoners to a mercenary or letting them go as you make your way through the Hero of Might section until you hit the 3 major opportunities for moral choices during the Spire, which are some of the most interesting ones overall. Then we finally reach the end of the game with the Shadow Court choice between giving up your youth to the court or letting them take the youth of this random girl that only results in a small cosmetic change. Until finally you reach the ultimate choice of the game after the last boss. So Sure, you can supplement the number of these choices by doing a handful of alignment-specific side quests like saving or destroying the Temple of Light or helping the farmer in Brightwall, but that only ends up adding maybe 3 or 4 moral options as side quests to the entire game. Thankfully, this all feels so much better in practice as you start to receive around 1 major moral choice every hour of gameplay or so, but when you break it down to the compartmentalized opportunities that you get throughout the game, it feels really quite barren as far as things go. So you'd better enjoy this little bit of roleplay as the timer ticks down and you thrust the seal into the arms of the naive girl only to watch the very essence of youth drain from her soul. Reaver will even remark about your appearance when you finally make your way back to his manor, whether or not you made the choice to take your own youth or give the girl's. But in a moment of betrayal, it seems like Reaver was planning on turning you into Lucian, at which point Lucian does a double betrayal back on Reaver in order to try and capture the two of you at the same time, which immediately makes the two of you allies for the time being in typical villain fashion. You start to retreat through Reaver's escape tunnels, fighting off spire guards along the way until you finally come to a beach where Teresa told the other heroes to help you out, and the final boss floats into view. The giant floating obelisk that's been attacking your party for the second half of the storyline makes its final appearance with all the foreshadowed threat of a monster spawner mixed with an artillery piece. And while the fight is relatively simple since all you really need to do is attack it when the weak point is open, it becomes a lot more fun thematically when you factor in the other heroes fighting by your side like the dark fantasy alternative to the Avengers. For all intents and purposes, your small group is invulnerable, and you prove it by fighting your way through wave after wave of Lucian's forces before you can finally take down the obelisk in a burst of light. It's stupidly easy, but that's also kind of fun to deal with every once in a while since it allows your character to feel growth over time. But we've already hit the point of no return, and the final handshake with Teresa instantly transports your party to the top of the hero's mountain back at Bower Lake. The 4 of you step onto your respective pedestals, unleashing beams of light into the main character until nothing really happens. The heroes collapse as the spire guards arrive to take you away before Lucian tries to put a bullet in your head for the second time. On the first shot, your loving dog takes the hit in your stead, but the second bullet makes its mark and sends you off to a dream world to meet your sister Rose once again. This change of pace is jarring to say the least, as your character explores a fantasy farmstead, kicking chickens back into their coop, smashing beetles by the crop fields, and trying to find the 20 bottles your sister hid around the area before night falls and you have to go to sleep. But things pick back up again just as fast as the tune from the music box wakes you up in the dead of night. A trail of tears and bodies and cries for help mar your path as you follow your childhood dream to its fruition, marking the countless bodies that lie in the wake of even the good character's journey up until this point. But this time, as you reach the music box, the song reaches its completion and you're transported back to the spire. Bodies line the stairs as your controller thrums to the beat of the mysterious power that Lucian seems to have unlocked, but when you finally reach him in the inner chambers, it seems to do him no good. Try as he might, Lucian can't put you to sleep like he once did at the beginning of your surface as a guardsman, and you unleash the power of the music box until he seems to resemble nothing more than a weak old man. Yet still he taunts you until you hit him, shoot him, burn him, or even let Reaver do the dirty work for you as the old lord topples into the abyss. It's a symbolic final battle, not a real test of skill like so many players would have liked to see, but I don't think the final boss for the game could have ever been a test of skill based on the way the combat works in the game. How can anything really test you in combat if your main character never dies? Sure, you can acquire scars, which you can make disappear just as easily by purchasing the right potion, but it seems to me like the lack of any true failure state hampered the ability to ever put real stakes on combat as something the player should care about. It remains my favorite implementation of combat across the series, but that also feels like it's in spite of the lack of any consequences for your actions instead of because of it. After all, the game only gives you 11 moral choices, of which the biggest result is the economic quality of the Bloodstone Old Quarter after what you did as a kid. Consequence just isn't in the style of what Fable 2 was going for, while a thematically important confrontation between a man that killed your sister and the power you now hold is a much stronger conflict than anything they could have done in combat. You've grown so much from that child that was thrown out of the castle window into a godlike being that's capable of killing just about anything that moves within your sight. So now it's your turn to send Lucian down into the abyss with a single shot, just like he did to you so many years ago. Or in the case that you doubt yourself, Reaver is more than willing to pave the path into your future with the man's death, no matter how morally righteous you might hold your character. Then, as the screen fades to white, Teresa comes to present you with the final choice between returning the lives of everyone who worked on the spire under Lucian's reign, returning the lives of your loved one and dog, or receiving 1,000,000 gold. But this ends up being just as frustrating as the lack of any final fight with Lucian, when most players feel compelled to take the wealth option due to the epilogue quests. You can't become the king or queen of Albion unless you spend the 1,000,000 gold to buy the Castle Fairfax at the end of the game, and even then you won't have the roundabout 300,000 gold it costs to buy Garth's old estate and complete the side quests you get for taking a nap in his bed. The alternative to this decision is if you want to make the morally good option, which does almost nothing except put a little red heart over the heads of all the random NPCs in the game, which feels really redundant other than the role-playing opportunities behind the choice. Then if your final choice involves returning your loved ones to life, you never actually get to see Rose, as she goes on some random adventure to a faraway land without even saying hi to you. And the dog is almost better to leave dead, since it allows you to dig up quest items without waiting for the dog to find it first. As a result, all three of the choices end up feeling unrewarding, since the only selfish choice you have an option for doesn't even give you enough gold to finish the epilogue quest lines that pop up after the final credits. So after you make the final unimportant choice in the game, full of choices without any consequence to you, the heroes each tell you their plans for the future and how they felt about you as a person before getting teleported off the spire by Teresa. Her ominous parting words to the hero imply she has plans for the spire moving forward, and the game cuts to black as the credits start to play. So, after I immersed myself in this fantasy simulation of a world, I found myself mildly okay with the ending to the story, since I don't think I ever really expected it to do anything good with the finale. It's really easy to pick things apart in retrospect when you can take all the details of context, but the actual emotions I felt as the end approached felt like they were in line with the way Fable 2 had treated its own story throughout the game. A series of repeating events with a preordained beginning, middle, and end, all of which felt like it was manufactured into existence by the meddling of Teresa. And while the storyline is a pretty okay experience to work your way through over the course of 8 hours worth of gameplay, I think the real charm for the game comes from its simulation elements and the random side quests you can run into along the way. As stupid as it sounds, the hour or two of game time I spent working as the bartender, just leveling up the craft and making tons of gold, felt like some of the best content in the entire game. And the way you can join either the Temple of Light in fighting the Temple of Shadows, or helping the Temple of Shadows in their sabotage, give you the chance to express your moral alignment that you never really get to see manifest in the actual main story. Then there's the fact that the game world will respond to your actions by either renovating the Temple of Light after you return from the Spire, or turning it into a ruin if you refuse to help them, is an incredible feeling of responsiveness from a game world. Likewise, as you return to Westcliff Village to find it looking like a downright pleasant place to live, after you had already experienced what it looked like as a bandit camp, helps the world feel like it's actually alive in ways that most modern games seem to discount the importance of. Likewise, these side quests also represent the vast majority of interesting game mechanics to the Fable universe, like the presence of shit-talking gargoyles for you to track down across the world, talking doors to open, and all manner of crazy stories and repeating characters like the Norman-Nomicron brothers Sam and Max. These are the stories behind Fable 2 that I won't be spoiling, because some of the best content in the game is locked behind these hidden stories and situations that give you the game mechanics that are so sorely missing from the main storyline. Instead, I'll be exploring the DLC additions to the game, which rack in at around 2 hours of game time for the main storyline on both editions, and yet are hardly even mentioned by most of the series' retrospective videos. The first DLC that came out was called Knothole Island on January 13th, 2009, almost 3 months after the initial release of the game, for which it had a noticeable focus on the weather capabilities of a video game world. Throughout the main storyline, Head Studios proved it could do some good winter effects with the tutorial section, along with some suitably dreary rainy sections as you made your way to Oakvale and Westcliff, but Knothole Island takes things just a couple steps further as you explore this idyllic island and their mysterious weather patterns. Perhaps the technology wasn't yet developed enough to actually implement dynamic weather effects over time, so instead the Fable team set about building a storyline where the island leaders held control over a set of totems that determines the weather on the island. When you first arrive, you'll immediately get attacked by the bloom effects. You'll immediately notice the beautiful snowy landscape as you traverse frozen lakes in a winter wonderland, but the village chieftain wants to turn the village into something closer to a summer paradise, and you descend into the Sun Temple in order to fight several packs of shadow mobs, activate pillars of fire like something out of a Zelda game, and melt your way to the totem at the end of the dungeon. As you walk out, the entire landscape of the island will have changed as the air shimmers in the desert heat, and all the waterways throughout the island seem to have been drained by the blistering sun. The actual change is so drastic that I had a hard time believing it was the same island that we started on, until I made my way back to the main town area to find it perched on what used to be a giant lake. Regardless, after some time passes, the townsfolk obviously become upset that the entire island has been beset by never-ending sun rays, so you travel back down into the Rain Temple where you'll traverse several waterways while triggering the flit switches as you progress through several puzzles along the dungeon path. You do remember flit switches, don't you? Oh right, I never mentioned them before because they basically don't exist during the main storyline except on the very beginning of the game. But now that some of the DLCs start to use them a lot more, we actually get to see some of the more unique gameplay mechanics that they can present as both puzzle devices and even a table tennis minigame where you're forced to keep up with the ball and kind of memorize its path. But eventually you'll run out of things to do with the new flit switch puzzles and make it to the final room with the rain totem that places the island under a never-ending monsoon. So this obviously isn't that much better than the never-ending drought, and the village chieftain sends you back down on one last journey into the heart of the Snow Temple. This time we'll be fighting our way up a grand staircase that resembles a mountaintop while fighting off even more shadows and triggering flit switches around the battle arena. Then, as you descend into the temple itself, we find an entirely new biome type, as the walkways and tunnels start to resemble something like a clockwork design, as though this entire island is just a machine of some type. After you've fought with the final troll boss in the game and activated the snow totem, it appears that the village finally has control over the weather once again, after they somehow got lost in the temples in the first place. The DLC then gives us a parting gift with the 12th and final major moral choice along anything that could be described as a main gameplay route, as you're forced to decide whether to leave the corrupt chieftain in control of the weather or give the power to the people and let them decide for yourself. This also happened to be the final quest that I needed in the game to finally become pure enough to receive a halo around my good playthrough's head, despite the fact that the evil counterpart looked like the devil by the time I hit the spire. So altogether, I had some good fun with this DLC, and especially enjoyed the fact that they implemented some really interesting weather effects that you can now choose between by using the totems after the main story is complete. Otherwise, the actual gameplay in the dungeon runs for the DLC also happens to be a step above the usual Fable-type linear affairs, as I was reminded of the thematic puzzle design from the Zelda games by the different temples. So, whether 2 hours of storyline are worth it for the $9.99 price tag is more of a personal question, but I'd actually say the diversity of gameplay is worth the price in this case, since it felt like they were really able to expand upon the typical quest design that you see throughout the rest of the series. The other major DLC that came out for the game on May 12, 2009 was titled See the Future and presented itself as the epilogue to the main story after we ended things with some heavy foreshadowing about what Teresa might do about the tower. Things start off as you make contact with Murgo the merchant that sold you the magical music box in the very beginning of the story, and this time he wants you to buy a couple of corrupted items in his wares that may or may not transport the user to some weird and wonderful lands befitting a hero. But what this actually boils down to is a grayscale world that you have to save from colorful enemies that can only be damaged by the appropriate button on your controller. Then you're transported to a haunted graveyard where you'll have to dress up as specific monsters in order to pass through gates and trigger certain mechanics like gaining the help of dead hobs. And while these sections are kind of fun, they're definitely not the highlight of the DLC, despite taking up the vast majority of the DLC game time. Instead, the focus is on a 5-minute long interactable cutscene where Teresa gives you a vision of the future and your place as the people's king or queen. Yet, despite all your grandeur and power as the hero of Albion, Teresa reveals that the true savior of this world will be your as of yet unborn child, as they might one day face the coming darkness. Apparently, Teresa has gained the ability to see all futures now that she has control over the spire, instead of only divining snippets like she once did, as the short sequence sets the scene for the upcoming story in Fable 3. And while it did certainly feel like a good tie-in between this game and the next, the rest of the DLC was kind of a letdown, and the only really recognizable part of the DLC are the colored enemies in the cursed snow globe, which are much more annoying than they are fun to deal with, considering it forces you to use weapons that you might not have ever bothered leveling up before. And while I genuinely enjoyed the costume party, Halloween type gameplay and the cursed skull, it felt like it ended far too soon, along with the final boss for the area that died after I hit him with a single rank 5 spell, which was a bit of a letdown. The other major area in the DLC is another arena section called the Colosseum that pits you against a never-ending stream of enemies for a set time period and asks you to try and get a high score to earn rewards, which might be cool if the game didn't already have a crucible as a repeatable arena challenge for Fable 2. Instead, the Colosseum tries to be a harder variant of the same minigame, as you're placed into a boring landscape without the same type of traps that you could use to your advantage in the Crucible, while it punishes you for ever getting hit. So as a mage who routinely had to stand in place letting the enemies wail on me while I'm charging my fireball, it felt like the Colosseum was really built with gunslingers in mind. So I played through it once, got ragdolled a lot as I found out that bugs can actually hug your face in this game while the Balverines bowl you over, and I never felt the need to bother with the minigame again. Even though it seemed like it might be an easy way to grind out money pretty quickly considering you get a gold coin for every point you score, by the time I had gotten to this DLC, I already saw everything I really wanted to in the game. No matter how much there was for me to do, like getting married, having a kid, leveling up all the different professions, finishing all the side quests, collecting all the keys and gargoyles, I felt well and truly done with the game by the time I hit the final credit roll. All of which brings us to a really awkward moment near the end of the critique where I have to bring up the fact that I felt compelled to collect every key and gnome in Fable 3 while I was ready to just be done with Fable 2. And that's despite the fact that I still believe that Fable 2 is a much better game than its sequel based off of pure mechanics. However, there's still one major problem that surfaced during these playthroughs, and that's the nature of map design. So while the Fable 2 maps do a good job of showing players the general layout of roads and shops around the area, they lack some fundamental design options like the ability to zoom in on the map, to hover over shop icons to see what type of shop it is, to see where the different exits lead to, or to even see the different locations you can fast travel to. And while it could be argued that they made the maps like this on purpose in order to encourage you to learn the areas through exploration, I just don't buy it. Following the Golden Trail helps alleviate this problem during quests, but when I wanted to find a barbershop in a city and had to just wander around hoping I ran into one, it just didn't feel right. And however minor it might seem, the fact that Fable 3 added collectible trackers on the overworld screen so that you could see your progress through the game was probably a really big factor why I wanted to collect those things. There's something really rewarding about finding a checklist to run through one block at a time until you've completed all the tasks, which felt like it was missing in the Fable 2 endgame. Sure, I could theoretically start renting out property and earn the money to buy both Castle Fairfax and Brightwall Tower, but I didn't feel the need to keep going anymore, and that's okay. Not every game needs to be a 100-hour journey from start to finish, and I'm sure that some of the more invested fans in the Fable universe could probably double the amount of time I spent in each of these games, but the alternative is just as sweet when you reach the end of the game and feel satisfied with how things turned out. For what it wanted to do, I think Fable 2 succeeded in building a comedic fantasy world with a grand narrative of heroes and villains without ever really taking itself seriously. And ironically, it's the juxtaposition between this Fable game and the sequel that makes our nostalgia run rampant as we fixate on everything Fable 2 was able to do better. If you haven't already seen my Fable 3 critique that should be coming out at the same time as this video, it's the differences between both games that make it so hard to narrow down just what I would want to see from the upcoming Fable 4. So while it's my personal preference that a new Fable game might resemble Fable 2 more than its sequel, it seems like whatever comes next is most likely going to have to deal with a very split player base, as each person deals with their nostalgic memories in a different way. For which I hope this critique might have been at least a little helpful in terms of refreshing your memory, even though each person's experience with the games is bound to be quite different due to all the simulation-based aspects. So, in closing, if there was one thing I think Fable 2 needs to improve upon, it would be the need for a true PC port of the game that's been sadly missing from our lives for the last decade, and might just be a chance for all the old fans to re-experience the world without having to drag out your old Xbox 360. So, I think Fable 2 stands the test of time as a fantastic game, as long as you're okay with the shorter type of experience it offers with a normal playthrough hitting the 10-hour mark and a completionist run coming closer to the 20 hours in total. Other than that, I always like to end my videos by shouting out some of the best YouTubers I've been watching recently, like KBash and the Fall of Fable video, The Salt Factory and his Was Fable as Good as I Remember video, or Liam Triforce, who finally released his rendition of an Ocarina of Time critique. But in case you actually like the sound of my voice, feel free to like and subscribe for more content as I try to release a new critique at least once a month, and what will most likely be my next project on the Spellforce 3 game, in case that's something you would be interested in. Otherwise, I hope you have a fantastic space of time until we meet again, and thank you for watching. Within just a few Somehow they found a way to take a one-button Just Castle Bowerstone for the Ew. These avengments essentially every bugger with enough depth, God. Nothing really happened as the music box just an excuse to get you down there to unlock magic, which oops. Where was I? Better enjoy this little bit of roleplay that you get. No. Pedestals, unleashing beams of light into the main character until... Ew. Okay. Ended for... Ew.